Hey guys, this is Nurse Jay at Nursing the Truth. I hope everyone is having a great day. And as always, I have my 2 chakra candles burning, my gods and goddesses behind me, my lapis lazuli on for intuition and guidance, and the Dallas Cowboys. So tomorrow we're having a great big game against the Saints. So we'll see if we can pull that one off. So cross your fingers. So we're still again in the book of the Masks of Christ, and I want to thank you for my new subscribers and thank you for the nice comments that you've been giving me about giving you some great information. So this video is for you. So remember yesterday I was telling you about the riffraff between Jesus and John, and even in the Gospels it talks about this back and forth against the disciples and him and John. Now, what's interesting about this is that, a lot of people don't pay attention to the Bible. They just go to church on a Sunday morning and listen to the preachers and don't go home and read what they have been given. Now, as I was telling you yesterday, Jesus goes on and on about this prophet. But in the book it says that Jesus goes on. Then what did you go out to see? Talking to his disciples, talking about this man and eating locust and fur and hollering in the wilderness, which is a representation of none only than the dog Anubis, howling in the wilderness, letting them know that Horus, the Christ, has been born. So, prophet, he says, yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. A term of exceptional honor, the author says, only otherwise according to Moses, which is a fictitious character. He then quotes a prophecy of Malachi. Bingo! Remember what I told you yesterday, my truth seekers, of Malachi about the Lord sending a messenger to prepare the way for him, explaining that it referred to John the Baptist. In Jesus' day, there was a widespread belief that the venerable Old Testament figure of Malachi had been the last of the prophets, God having withdrawn the gift of prophecy after him, and that it would only be restored in order to herald in the last days. So, essentially, Jesus' message is that John the Baptist had ushered in the end times. So, remember what I said about the star prophecy. It was very, very apocalyptic. These writings were written 500 to 600 years prior to the first century. Remember the Babylon captivity, you see, in the 562 BCE. And the first century was a hotbed for zealots and Sicarii, because Israel was tired of being invaded by different hooligans. But see, what one fails to know is that Judea was under the Egyptian province, and the Babylonians came in the Egyptian province to Judea. They tried to get into Egypt twice, but got their ass kicked at Egypt's door. There was not enough army or military to fight these Babylon hooligans in Judea. So they were taken over. And during this time of the Babylon captivity, a lot of these Judeans that actually fled from Egypt the first time during the Akhenaten reign of leaving, they came back to Alexandria, Egypt, and stayed, and there is where you have your Kabbalist. Thank you, Nurse Jade, for giving me the historical record of this. Now, it says, he continues, this Jesus says, Truly I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet, whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Wow. Let's read this again because I'm fixing to give you a little tidbit of information. Truly I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist, yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. A slap in the face. Jesus is saying that he is greater than John the Baptist. He is stating that he was born of a woman as well. Why would God say that he was from a mortal woman and that making all this stuff up and a competition between John the Baptist and him? The authors say this is very odd. The exact meaning of these words has always been a hot topic among historians and theologians and New Testament scholars, not to mention ourselves, the authors, because although the first part seems to praise John unequivocally, the second looks dangerous, like some kind of insult. But Jesus himself said only the first part. Scholars now agreed that the second clause was a later addition. Yes, I do believe that as well, truth seekers. Telling us what the early church thought of the relationship between Jesus and John. Carl Kraling points out that both the phrases more than a prophet and there has not risen anyone greater must be authentic because the early church was scarcely in a mood with respect to the Baptists who have created them itself. However, the reason that the early Christian authors of the Quell Q source felt compelled to add the second part, the disclaimer to Jesus's words, is enormously significant. If they had not done so, their religion would have failed there and then. If the church had allowed Jesus's original words to remain unchanged, the church's claim that Jesus was the Christ would obviously been invalidated. Jesus himself says that John the Baptist is, in quotation, present tense, as he was still alive at the time, the greatest person that ever lived. Surely an astonishing and truly far-reaching statement on his own testimony Christ is admitting being subordinate to the Baptist. So why would God, the creator of the universe, come down to the material world from the ethereal world and say he was subordinate to a mortal man? BS and BS. As the whole point of the church's interpretation of Jesus's incarnation was that a time bomb waiting to go off and simply could not be left unchanged. And as early Christianity was faced with a rival movement that proclaimed John the Baptist as Messiah, yes, they did, my truth seekers. And that's why he was killed. It could easily have exploited Jesus' words as propaganda to win over Christians to that sect, as indeed they were. Some have suggested that the phrase born of women was slightly a implication of weakness. If so, this could be another later addition rather than Jesus' own words. Otherwise, it would undermine his basic message. So, a lot of these writers that wrote in Alexandria, Egypt, whether it be in the Ptolemaic period, Roman period, a little bit of both, but especially in the Constantinian era by Eusebius and Origen, Tertullian. Go do your research on the early church fathers from the 2nd and 3rd century and 4th century. Bunch of hooligans. But even at that, there was a book that I read from a man back in the 15th or 16th century, I believe, that come across some old material in a library in Europe. And it showed that the church fathers during the Dark Ages and even before the Renaissance actually were the true penmen under the name of the early church fathers. That it actually wasn't those men that actually lived at the time, but these bastardized monks and these bastardized people wrote under their name. And that is totally sick to me. So you're actually reading something that, quote, the 2nd and 3rd century and 4th century church fathers supposedly said, but it was possible that it was actually written 1,000 years later and put under their name. So your mind is thinking this exactly what it was happening and exactly what they were saying, exactly what they were doing, and it was none of the sort. Because organized Christianity was not done until the latter 300s CE. So then it says with this John the Baptist, up to this point, Matthew and Luke had been virtually identical, but then they diverge. Luke with the significant aside. All the people, even the tax collectors, when they heard Jesus' words, acknowledged that God's way was right because they had been baptized by John. But the Pharisees and the experts in the law rejected God's purpose for themselves because they had not been baptized by John. The Pharisees is an offshoot group of the Essenes, my dear truth seekers. Josephus wrote about the only 3 groups that were hotbeds in the first centuries: Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and then crept in the 4th philosophy, your zealots / Sicarii. Nothing about organized Christianity and this bullshit of quote unquote Paul establishing Christianity in 63 all over the world and all the nations. That's a lie. Because Josephus started getting into these little sects, he says, at the age of 16. He was born in 37. Do the math. 37 and 16 around the time Paul was supposed to be going and doing the Christianity conversions. No record. The Paul I said was Apollonius of Tyana from Ephesus and Tarsus. And he was a / Nazarene, Essene, Gnostic. And those were your first Christians. Now, so it was John who determined whether someone was in or out of the movement. Matthew, however, continues Jesus' statement in a different way. So let's compare. Luke compared to Matthew. Matthew says, "From the days of John the Baptist till now, the kingdom of heaven had been subjected to violence, and violent people have been raiding it. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who was to come." You see, Mark was the first book that was written by a author we don't know, but under the name of Mark. And Mark was the most popular name in the Roman Empire. Mark, Marcus, Little Mark, Marcion, who knows? And Matthew, if you go to Mark is kind of rare, random, not a lot of information. The Matthew, boy, they make it look so divine. But it gets worse in John. It's very Gnostic. Although the meaning of the first sentence has long puzzled theologians, the significance of the whole statement is that Jesus is saying that John the Baptist was God's instrument for ushering in God's kingdom, assuming a role for him that conflicts with his betrayal by the church and the Gospels. It is unlikely that the church, engaged as it was in asserting Jesus' superiority over John, would have created a passage which credits John with the decisive act in the shift of the eons, or that it would portray Jesus as merely John's successor. In other words, Jesus presented John the Baptist as the herald, not of himself, but of the coming kingdom of God. But further, immensely significant light is shed on this passage by the original Hebrew version of Matthew's Gospel, which gives the above saying, "Truly I say to you, among all those born of women, none has arisen greater than John the Baptist. From his days until now, the kingdom of heaven has been oppressed, and senseless persons have been rendering it. For all the prophets and the law spoke concerning John. If you wish to receive it, he is Elijah, who is to come." So, you have the Hebrew version of Matthew's Gospel. And what's funny is the Gnostic Egyptians, the Ebionites, went by the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Hebrews. And it's funny because in the Nag Hammadi scriptures, these Gnostic Christians, if you will, had the Gospel of the Egyptians, which in turn is the Gospel of Matthew. So go and read that free for you on the internet. The Gospel of the Egyptians. So basically, the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of heaven is to come. If you go look up those words in BibleHub.com, it's not saying that an actual, see, we have been bamboozled. We are thinking that this damn thing is going to come out of the sky's going to come open, the kingdom is coming down, they're going to have this fight, the Perseus white horse and swords and these banners and you know, look, that has got to be the biggest blue beam projection I would have to witness. It looks so real, just like the Twin Towers down with the airplanes. Holographic bullshit. It looks real. So anyway, the kingdom of God, or kingdom of heaven, meant for an actual kingdom to take place on earth, a king. John was the one that was going to lead this insurrection against Rome. And they killed him for it. He was the Messiah to come. He was the person to start this. But he wasn't Elisha. They took it into their hands. And see, because this person or whoever it was knew the scriptures from the Old Testament. Even though you might be a Gnostic and you might not follow quote unquote Judaism, you know the scriptures, because the only monotheistic religion at that time, even in Egypt and in Judea, was Judaism. Whether he was brought up in Judaism and then went off into the Gnosticism, which is something totally different, because Gnosticism teaches that the kingdom of God is within you. Judaism teaches that there is a God that is going to come and do all this and is going to usher in and bring a king into the kingdom. So they knew all this. So you're going to go around telling everybody, this is what the scriptures was saying. This is the man. This is him. This is him. This is him. But John says, I'm not a prophet. I'm not Elijah. So anyway, truth seekers, I hope you have enjoyed this video. I will be bringing you more truth here shortly. So bundle up, stay warm. Hotep and Ashe. We'll see you soon. Goodbye.